Welcome to a new video in my home automation series, and this time I'm going to talk about InfluxDB and Grafana. And I want to do it slightly different because, obviously InfluxDB and Grafana has been around for a long time. So there are a lot of videos on how to install and how to do the configuration of each of these systems. So I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. First of all, since most people have done most of their InfluxDB videos. Probably some of them are 2 or 3 years old. And since InfluxDB 2.0 came out, so that's something new. And I thought that since I'm installing something new, I should, install InfluxDB 2.0. InfluxDB 2.0 has some differences from 1.0. So there is a new query language. So the way you are using it in Grafana is something different as well. So obviously there are some challenges. So what I want to talk about in this video is just highlight the differences between 1.0 and 2.0, how you are going to install 2.0 and how you can use it in Grafana. And I also going to install Telegraf to gather some system metrics. So in this video, I'm going to talk about Node-RED at all. I thought installing Grafana is going to be an easy way to just, gather some data so we can, use dashboard and do some of the reporting and actually just set up both InfluxDB and Grafana so we can see how the integration works in between them. Just like previously, I have gone to my document and I've extended it. So if you have seen it recently, I mean a couple of hours, then you probably notice that there are some differences. This whole InfluxDB and Grafana section is starting to become a little bit too big. So I decided that I move it into a separate document. So in the top, you can find the link to this separate InfluxDB and Grafana section. And before I start the video, I just want to say that I decided to install everything manually on my own. So I'm not using Docker images. So if you want to say that you should have used Dockers, please don't bother, because I decided not to use Docker. I don't want to learn another system, even though probably I should. But I decided that in this, I'm not setting this up to test something. So I just want to learn all that is needed to set this up. And also, I've run into issues where, maybe not with InfluxDB and Grafana, but somebody was installing some components in Docker, and then he wasn't able to do the things that I was able to do because that would require for some components to either talk to other components inside or outside the Docker. And if I would have something like that, I would have no way of fixing that, or I don't know how to resolve that. So this is why I decided to install everything manually. But if you want to use Docker, just go ahead. The installation step is going to be different, but everything else is probably going to be the same anyway. So there's not going to be any change there. And I think I'm going to dive straight in. So first of all, how we are going to install InfluxDB. And obviously, I just followed an article that you can see here. So if you are interested in the exact details, and obviously there are more steps documented here than in my document. For example, how you can, check the versions and some of the other details. But if you are, if you only need the key things, that I've copied the instructions that you need in order to get Grafana, InfluxDB 2.0 installed. And first of all, you need to add the GPG key to your system, and then you add the repo as well. And finally, I think it's, it's included here. So you do an update and then you install InfluxDB 2. And after that, you can just, start the InfluxDB service. And so you can enable the InfluxDB service to start whenever your device starts. And finally, we are also going to install the user interface. So that's going to be a separate step. So once you have installed everything, there is one critical step that we need to do, is we need to do this initial InfluxDB setup. And you can just use this influx space setup command in your command line. And that is going to ask you a few questions. So it's going to ask you an organizational ID, so just give whatever ID that you want. It's going to ask for an admin user ID and password. It doesn't have to be admin, so you will see that I didn't pick the word admin, I just picked something else. And I think there's going to be an initial bucket that you need to set up. And Once you do that, then your InfluxDB should be ready to use. And then by default, the InfluxDB runs on port 8086. So once you do that, you should be able to log into InfluxDB. So this is how the UI or the graphical UI looks like. I'm not really sure if this graphical UI is actually InfluxDB 2.0 related or whether it existed in 1.0 as well. If you used InfluxDB 1 in the past, then there are a few different, there are a few changes as far as I understood, because actually I also installed InfluxDB 1 and I removed it and I installed 2. First of all, the databases are called buckets now, but the rest of it is, well, as far as I know, is pretty much the same. So you still have measures, which are basically the tables in all SQL database systems. And then you also have, within each tables, you have keys that are the sort of like the searchable filter values. So if I do explore and I pick one of the table, so as you can see, these are the measurements, and you have the fields that you filter on, and finally you have the values. So if I go, these are the values. And so if you used InfluxDB before, there is no change in that one. There will be some further changes relating to continuous queries, which I want to use in the future, which is now called tasks. But then I think there is a lot of other similarities. I mean, obviously you have to think about retention policies, which I definitely want to talk about this video. But now it just gets a little bit easier because, for example, when you want to set up a new bucket, so a new database, then it will ask you about the default retention policy. I think in the old command line interface, it was usually set up with an auto-gen retention policy, which was set to infinite, but here you are asked that question and you can easily pick either never or pick one of the retention policies from this drop down here. And of course, the big difference is going to be the query language, and that is going to be apparent once we go into the Telegraf integration. Because with 1.0, there was a query language which is called an InfluxQL, which was more like an SQL type query language. And with 2.0, the query language is different. And the problem with this query language is that the InfluxDB, the Grafana doesn't support a query editor for that. So as you can see, I have actually created two data sources. One, it both points to the same table in InfluxDB, but one is set up with the new Flux query language, which is the second one, and the first one is with the old one. I'm going to talk about later in the video between how you set up both of them. And as you can see in the old InfluxQL database connection, you have this editor here, so you can, it's going to show you what are your tables and what are your measurements and the field values, so you can select everything from here. And if you change to the new Flux query language, you don't get the editor, so you basically just get a text editor where you have to enter the query manually. But of course, there is a workaround how you can create a Flux query without actually writing the query. So back in the InfluxDB UI, if you click Explore, then you can explore your database here. So I select, let's say, Telegraf CPU, and let me see the CPU system, total Node-RED server, and let's say 12 hours. So that's going to give us the graph. And now you can go into the script editor, and that is going to show you the query. So this is the Flux query, and as you can see, it is fairly similar to the SQL, but well, obviously still different. So if you just copy this one and you come here and then you paste it in and run query, you will get the same information back here. Probably it's a different scale, so this is why we are seeing more spikes. But sort of that's the workaround between building the query in Influx and then just copying the final query statement over to Grafana. Okay, so this is all good, and as I said, I'm going to talk about how you can set up Telegraf. And and we are just going to use Telegraf to just gather some data so we can do some reporting. I probably are going to spend more time on Telegraf in the future, how you can just add more stuff to it, but that's going to be for a future video. So back in the InfluxDB UI, you come to data and then buckets, and then you create yourself a new bucket. I mean, I've already done that, so I just created Telegraf. And I think at this point, it is probably good, it's a good idea to talk about a retention policy. I mean, you know, system usage, CPU usage, disk usage, this is something that you don't really need for more than a week, I think. So when I created my Telegraf bucket, I already created with a 7-day retention policy. So anything which is older than 7 days, it's automatically get deleted. So as you can see, the Telegraf integration is, or the Telegraf node is here. Sorry, bucket is created. And now what I can do is if I go back to my document, I can see how I install the Telegraf. And so this is something that I don't really understand, because there is also a Telegraf thing here, and you can actually create a new configuration, but it wasn't really working for me. And you know, it has some setup instructions as well, how you can, you know, copy these statements here into your you know, browser window, and that's going to launch the Telegraf service. And it did, but then I was never able to find the, you know, where the configuration is stored, and whenever I restarted the computer, it wasn't restarting with this configuration. So even though I created this setting here, I don't actually use it anymore. So I've gone back to, again, going back to the Telegraf documentation on how you need to install a Telegraf on the system. Again, there is an article for that. So if you want to read the whole article with all the, you know, different steps and a lot of explanation, you can just go through here. But I've also copied all the required configuration here. So again, you can just execute these commands to add the PGP key, GPG key, whatever key at the repo, and also install Telegraf. And once you have installed Telegraf, then you can also check that the Telegraf service is running. So it's going to say running. And here you can see that it is executing Telegraf with this config. So etc telegraf telegraf.conf. So that's the actual config what the service is using. So I just started, you know, sudo nano and this Telegraf, the configuration file, and I started making some changes to it. And by default, there is a lot of things that are enabled in the Telegraf configuration. There's a lot of stuff which is not. So we are not going to get all the information about network usage, because I think that requires some more configuration, but we can get the basics. But definitely what you need to do is you need to create the InfluxDB configuration manually. What I had to do in the configuration file, that it has a section which is called outputs.influxdb. And this is the section that you would use if you have an InfluxDB 1.x setup. But because we have an InfluxDB 2 setup, I deleted that entire section and replaced it with the one that I have here. And it basically has 3 different things that you need to configure. First is the URL and the token, sorry, 4, the organization and the bucket. So the URL, obviously, if you are running it, Telegraf on the same server as InfluxDB, it's going to be localhost colon 8086. And the next one is the API token. And you can get this API token if you go back to the InfluxDB UI, you go to API tokens, you're going to have 2 tokens here. So the first one is your admin token. As I said, my user ID is not called admin, it's called Nigma. So this is why it says Nigma's token. But once you created the bucket, it automatically creates another API token for that bucket. So if you click on this one, you're going to see your API token here. So you can just copy this to the clipboard, and that's what goes into the Telegraf configuration file. So that's the token. The organization is again the organization ID. The bucket is the bucket ID. So in my case, that was Telegraf. And then if you well, there is nothing else, everything else is commented out. But if you just do this and then you restart your computer, it's going to pick up the new configuration file, and your Telegraf service is going to be running, and it's going to be publishing the data into the new bucket that you have created. And if you just let the system run for, let's say, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, or just a couple of minutes, you should be able to see, first of all, that if you go back to the Explorer, you select the Telegraf, you will see that the measurements get created automatically. And if you just, just start a sample report, like, system usage, CPU total, and the host, and then you submit, you should be able to see some data coming through. So if that is happening, well, obviously your Telegraf is working and it's publishing the data into InfluxDB. So with all this, I think it is time to look at Grafana. But first of all, I can also quickly go through the installation of Grafana, which is actually up here. Again, I found an article that I followed, and actually there are a few different steps involved here. So in this document, it talks about the actual installation of Grafana, and as you can see, there are a couple of different versions. So I installed the Grafana Enterprise and the stable version and not the main version. So the only thing you have to take care of or pay attention to is you have a couple of commands here on the top, and then you have a command either for the stable release or the beta release. Obviously, you only want to execute this line and not this line. And after that, you just go through the update, the update and the installation process, and that's it. So this is how you install the enterprise versions. Again, this section here. And once you are finished with that, then there is a section here, I also talk about in this document, that start the server in systemd. So that talks about the final setup, making sure that the Grafana is installed as a service and it automatically starts whenever your computer starts. And with these two things, you should be able to set up Grafana. So again, it's just a few commands. It doesn't take an awful lot of time. And once you have done that, you should be able to launch Grafana on the default port, which is port 3000. And then by default, you have an admin access. And once you log into Grafana, it's going to look something like this. So this is the landing page, and obviously the first thing that you are going to do is you are going to set up the InfluxDB connection. And as I mentioned before, there are two ways to set up the connection. First of all, you can set up an InfluxQL connection, and that will allow you to use the built-in editor, the query editor in Grafana to build a report. Or you use the Flux connection where you don't have that editor. Well, at least you don't have it now. Maybe in a future version of Grafana, that's going to be supported as well, but it's just not at the moment. So first of all, I think I'm going to talk about the easier one. Well, maybe the easier one is the Flux connection, which is the native connection. So you go to configuration and data sources, and you can just add a data source and you select InfluxDB. So, and here I'm just going to go into my existing data sources. So this InfluxDB Telegraf is my new version 2.0 data source. Let's put it that way. So when you create it, you give it a name. The query language is Flux. So this is the new thing which is supported in InfluxDB 2x, or actually a 1.8 plus. So first of all, you have the URL. Oh, by the way, everything I talk about is fully documented here. In a very short section, I haven't included screenshots, but at least you have all the details here. So this is the URL. Obviously, it's localhost 8086 if you're running it on the same computer as InfluxDB. And important thing is not to enable anything in the authentication. So we don't need any of these. And in the InfluxDB section down here below, you need the organization. You need the bucket. I usually create a data source for every single bucket, so I include the bucket name here. And you also need to put in a token. And this time the token is, if you go back to the InfluxDB, we go back to API tokens. So this time it is your admin token. That's what you need to put in, because only the admin token would be able to see obviously all the different databases. And if you're using this token for the bucket as well, you get a message, but it won't be able to read the data for some reason, even if you specify the bucket, or at least this is how it worked for me. So again, you click here and then you copy this token, and that's what you're going to put in here. And once you save it, then it just shows it's configured. And then if you save and test, then it says that the data source is updated and 4 buckets are found, but I would only be using the Telegraf. And now you can, explore. So if you are in the InfluxDB Telegraf, Telegraf, then you can build your query. I don't have the example here anymore. So this is how you set up the connection. And then if you want to set up an InfluxQL connection, then before you can do that, you have to do one additional step, which is actually documented here in this forum. And you can go through this whole forum discussion. The important thing is mentioned somewhere further. It's actually mentioned in here. So in order to use an Influx One or an InfluxQL connection, you have to do something which is called the mapping buckets to databases. And the way I understood it is, obviously in the old Influx world, we were using databases and not buckets, and probably there is different ways how this information is stored. So anyway, the bottom line is you have to create this mapping, and you create this by issuing this command, and you can just do it in the command line here. So it's Influx version 1 dbrp create, and then dash dash and the database name. So this is a new name that you are going to give to your database. So you do it for every single bucket. So let's say, my example, my bucket was called Telegraf, so my DB is now called Telegraf hyphen dash, I think I said Grafana. So just to indicate that I'm using this, or I created this so I can use it in Grafana. And then the RP, so dash dash RP is the retention policy. And here I just specified autogen, which is the default infinite retention policy. I still don't understand how that works together with the retention policy on your bucket. So if the retention policy on your bucket is more restrictive, then I'm guessing the database would not store the data any longer because it's not being replicated, it's just a mapping. But I'm just speculating here, I have no idea. Actually, I asked this very question right in the in this forum discussion. I think this is the last question because nobody answered it yet. So we'll see, but the autogen is the default. You see my question here. So the autogen is the default retention policy. So you don't have to create anything separate. And then the next parameter is dash dash bucket ID. And here you have to specify the bucket ID, which is not the same as the bucket name. Again, if you go back to the InfluxDB UI, you go to buckets, and that's your bucket ID here. You can click here and then it copies to the keyboard. You can also add dash dash default. I didn't do that. And in the full documentation, you can also specify the organization. I just have one organization. I don't have the same databases in multiple organizations. So I only provide the DB, RP, and the bucket. And that will take a couple of seconds, and that's going to create you a database. So as you can see, that was the format that I used. And then once that is done, now we can go back to Grafana, and we can just go settings, data sources, and we can create a new one. And this is the InfluxDB InfluxQL. It's still pointing to the Telegraf service, so probably I should use a better naming convention so I can just know which connection is which. So obviously specify a name, and this time we can use the InfluxQL query language. The top one is pretty much the same, so we are using the URL, which is the same. We are not modifying anything else. We specify or tick the basic authentication, and here you specify the user ID and the password. So that's the same user ID and the password that you use to log into your Influx UI, and that's what you specified in the setup process. You also need to set up a custom HTTP header, so you just click on add, and the value or the key is authorization, and the value is, I mentioned here, so the value is the word token with capital T and space, and then your admin API. So it's the same thing that we have used before. So that admin API. So again, you just type token space and then you paste in this admin API. And here, the database name is going to be the name of the database that we just created with the dbrp command. The user ID and the password is the same user ID and password that we just used above, and the HTTP method is get. And then, once you do this, again, your data source is working. So again, if I go back to explore, just as I showed before, and if I select this InfluxQL data source, then now I have the option to select again measurements, and the keys as well. So let's say, what was it? CPU system. And if I put into bars, no, actually lines. Why is it not doing lines? Anyway, and if I would do, I think I said 12 hours, then yeah, we are getting the same type of line that we have seen in InfluxDB as well. So it is definitely working both ways. And actually, there is one more thing that I wanted to say in relation to Telegraf and InfluxDB and Grafana. If you go to, where is this? This one, dashboard, and then home. And if you want to create a new dashboard, I always, it's here in Browse, you can import. And you can import dashboards that are shared by the community. And there is a dashboard which is called 5955. And that's a very popular, system metrics dashboard. I already have it installed, so this is why it is showing me this error message. But this dashboard, it was designed with an InfluxQL type of connection. So this is why I wanted to play around with this whole thing, because if you point this dashboard to a Flux data source, it's just not going to work. If you go through all this hoop that I just talked about and you create an InfluxQL data source, then it's going to work. So if I go back to my dashboards and then home, then at least you can see that it is working and it's giving me data. And not everything is working. As I said, there are some standard deliveries in the default Telegraf configuration file, but there are a few other things that you have to enable manually and set up, specific to your system. So as you can see, I have disk usage and this time, but for example, when I go to the network section, it's completely empty. So probably I have to configure all the network related stuff in here. As you can see, no packets, no TCP data. So that's probably going to depend on whether you're using wireless or Ethernet connection. But hopefully I will be able to cover it in a future video. So this is where I am at the moment. This is what I wanted to include in this video. So at least you can do the initial setup of InfluxDB and then Grafana. Again, you can choose to go with InfluxDB, let's say 1.8. So you don't have to have this mapping process, and you can just use InfluxQL. But I'm guessing at some point they would stop supporting 1.0. So sooner or later we have to go to 2.0. And at least since I'm starting with 2.0, actually 2.1 at this moment, I don't have to go through any migration process. So at least that's going to save me some time. I probably in the future videos, I'm going to play around with Telegraf a little bit more, just to include a few more details that I want to capture about my system. And well, since I have Telegraf installed, I might just use that. And then once everything is working, I will go back to actually Node-RED and start working with Node-RED and InfluxDB. So I think that would be all for today. As I said, I'm going to include the article in the video description that I use, where I stored all the settings, and I have all the descriptions and links that you need to follow this whole process. But that should be enough for today. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.